The War to End All Wars. African Americans respond to World War I. In June of 1914, Archduke Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie were assassinated by a Bosnian nationalist. This act drew the powerful countries of Europe into a rapidly brewing conflict that became known as the Great War. The war pitted the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria against the Allied powers of Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and Romania. Tangled alliances, territorial greed, government instability, and huge military buildups had existed within the nations of Europe for years before the deaths of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife. Their assassination was the proverbial explosion of the powder keg, which triggered this horrible, bloody war. The United States saw no need to become embroiled in the conflict until a series of events drew the country into the war. In May of 1915, a German U-boat sank the British ocean liner Lusitania in the waters around Great Britain, killing hundreds of innocent victims, including many Americans. 1 month later, the Germans sank 4 more United States merchant ships. Finally, in 1917, after learning about a secret proposal transmitted from Germany to Mexico for a military alliance against the United States, the country prepared for war. Congress quickly passed an arms appropriation bill, and on April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson called upon the Congress to declare war against Germany. The United States was finally in the fight that became known as the War to End All Wars. Prior to World War I, the Army established 4 standing African American companies: the 24th and the 25th Infantry, and the 9th and 10th Cavalry. These troops saw action in the Western Territories during the American Indian Wars and in the southwestern states during the Spanish-American War. These companies were the primary black units in place when the United States entered World War I. When Congress passed the Selective Service Act in May of 1917, all American males between the ages of 21 and 31 were required to register for the draft. At that time, 13% of those inducted into the service were African American. Blacks saw the war as an opportunity to prove to the white population that they too were loyal, patriotic Americans who deserved to be treated equally. Unfortunately, discrimination occurred at all levels of the military during the war and was a reflection of the racial attitudes in the country at that time. Within the United States, the Army used African American units as labor battalions, supply units, and for support services for the war effort. Some of their duties involved loading and unloading supplies on trains and ships, and transporting men and materials. Many overseas companies also operated as support service units. When pressure mounted from the black community to utilize black troops in combat, the Army created the 92nd and 93rd Divisions. When African American men first began combat duty, their tasks involved digging trenches, clearing disabled equipment, and clearing explosives from battlegrounds, also burying dead soldiers. As the war progressed, the soldiers served on the front lines and performed many other duties, such as chaplains, surveyors, chemists, and intelligence officers. After the creation of the African American combat divisions, popular demand forced the Army to establish officer training courses for black soldiers. The Army established a segregated officer training camp at Fort Des Moines in May of 1917. Later, black officer candidates trained at camps in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Panama. In all, 1,353 commissioned officers graduated from these training camps. The soldiers who enlisted also found themselves traveling from southern states to train in other parts of the country. For most, this was the first time they had left the South. Those who served overseas were exposed to the cultures of foreign countries. This period opened their eyes to life in other parts of the world. President Wilson's theme of "the world must be made safe for democracy" prompted African Americans to ask whether the United States was safe for democracy for all of its people, both black and white. Historian Chad Williams stated, "For African Americans, the war became a crucial test of America's commitment to the ideal of democracy and the rights of citizenship for all people, regardless of race." The United States failed that test. Widespread racial violence occurred throughout the war, and horrifying bloodshed between whites and blacks resulted from riots in St. Louis, Missouri, and Houston, Texas. In the southern states, the number of lynchings soared as vigilante whites usurped the law and blacks paid the price. This racial turmoil spurred African Americans to take political action through groups such as the NAACP and newer civil rights organizations formed in response to the violence. Black newspapers and journals urged activism by the African American community. Women's groups also became energized by the war. The YMCA, the Red Cross, and the National Association of Colored Women supported the black troops. Women working outside their homes for the first time rallied for equitable working conditions in their new jobs. Black women joined the ranks of white women in demanding the right to vote. The years of World War I set the stage for and accelerated the urgency for the desegregation movement in the years following 1920. World War I ended on November 11, 1918, when the armistice between the defeated Central and victorious Allied powers took effect. African American soldiers made a major contribution to that victory, both in France and at home in the United States. During the fighting in France, the 92nd and 93rd Divisions suffered 5,181 casualties. Many of these African Americans made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. The troops came back home from foreign or in-country duty expecting the appreciation of the American people. Rather than receiving a hero's welcome from a grateful nation, many African American soldiers faced increased racial prejudice. Nevertheless, their gallant service laid the foundation for the desegregation of the armed services by President Harry Truman 3 decades after their return.